Hi, good morning. I guess in the interest of time, we'll just get rolling here. Quick show of hands. Anybody see any grasshoppers this year? Got a couple of hands. So important consideration. We've got 85 species of grasshoppers in the province. Only about 4 of these are typically pests. So these include the clearwing on top, migratory, Packards, and two-stripe grasshopper. The bulk of the population that we're going to see in Saskatchewan is two-stripe. I'll talk a little bit about their host preferences, but there is a resource right there, and I encourage you to point your phone at that, record it. We've got about a 40-minute webinar on grasshopper identification and considerations for control. So if you want to get really into the weeds on that one, then that's a good resource for you. So many accounts of spraying. I'm sure many of you have probably encountered this, including multiple sprays. I didn't hear very much about product shortages like we saw in 2021, but many accounts of spraying. Conditions are also favorable for a buildup of grasshoppers from last year that could contribute to great populations coming up this spring. And I'll talk about some of those. I'll talk briefly about host preferences. When we're talking about clearwing at the top here, this one is a cereal specialist. It loves grasses. And there are, without getting too much into the weeds about why that might be, or what dictates their host preferences, just remember clearwing likes grasses. So if you're seeing this camouflage pattern on the hind wing in a cereal, that is a serious cereal pest. They tend to occur a little bit earlier as adults, so they can be adults mid-July. Depends. Everything's heat dependent on these ones. Migratory grasshopper, real garbage guts. I mean, if it's a plant, they will eat it. They will eat each other, and they will eat other insects. And there was an account of them actually stripping the paint off of outbuildings in the south of the province this summer. So, push comes to shove, they'll eat almost anything. Are those good food resources? Not a lot of paint specialists in the insect world, but they'll fill their bellies with what they need. Packards, they tend to like legumes, so for legume growers, they can be a significant issue. Populations weren't terribly high. We did see a couple of hot spots near Saskatoon this year of that one. The bulk of the province, two-striped. And this one is relatively generalized. It does prefer forbs. It will munch on cereals, but it doesn't do very well on cereals. And this one's a bit of a notorious head clipper. So it'll climb up the stem, munch on the stem, and despite not actually doing a lot of damage to that plant, it's reduced the yield to nil because you've lost that head. So next slide. And I'm only conditionally good with this, so if things come off the rails, that's what happened. We'll talk about predictions for next year, and a lot of these are based on migratory grasshopper work that was done by Owen Olfert at Ag Canada. So some of his work he published in 2020, and what he indicated was that warm springs really important for these animals. Again, they're ectotherms. Everything about these animals is dictated by temperature. So their development, so that is the speed at which they hatch, the timing of their hatch, the speed at which they work through their development, so the occurrence of adults, and their survivorship. They don't like it cool and moist, and they're really prone to bacterial and fungal infections, and this can really knock them back. So if it's warm spring with some green feed, then those nymphs can do really well, speed through their development, and that can contribute. We had a bit of a delayed spring in parts of the province, and that actually really slowed them down. So in the east, northeast, southeast, we saw a real delay to the emergence of these grasshoppers and a bit of a reduction in populations. They did come roaring back in portions of the east, and of course in central regions and southern regions. So they like it warm and dry. They're real heat lovers. All 4 of these species are real heat lovers. And they do best when things are, in the low 30s. So again, more rapid development of eggs, nymphs, adults, and of course late summer and right into the fall, we had really good conditions for these girls to get their eggs into the ground. So, and that continued right through to October. In the Regina area, I was seeing ovipositing females, second week of October. They were looking pretty tatty. I mean, the birds had their way with it, and gophers are actually important predators of grasshoppers. If you take the time to watch gophers, I had one he was consuming probably 40 gophers an hour, or 40 grasshoppers an hour. Yeah, this enormous grasshopper consuming gophers. That'd be a whole nother thing, wouldn't it? So gophers will eat grasshoppers. They munch on them like hot dogs. So again, oviposition conditions were really good in the fall. We had really good populations, and so barring a really cool, wet spring and conditions that are going to contribute to delayed development and delayed emergence and disease, I think we're probably looking forward to some significant grasshopper pressures. So looking at the forecast, so this was a survey conducted by SCIC on about 1,400 sites across the province. The bulk of what was detected was two-stripe, although we did have some migratory hotspots as well. But you can see this coincides really well. This is the occurrence of the animals, and this is the occurrence of warm, dry conditions during the oviposition period. So in these regions, at least, I think we can probably expect significant grasshopper pressure again, barring, looking into the crystal ball, we can't say exactly what's going to happen in the spring, but, barring, any sort of grasshopper apocalypse, apocalypse for the grasshoppers, we'll say. So they are prone to natural enemies, like anything else. They are crunchy and delicious, if you ask a gopher. So a lot of vertebrate predators, but we'll just talk about three here. One that is really conspicuous are these Epicotta blister beetles. And sometimes you'll go out into a canola field and you can see thousands of these things. Like every head is covered with these blister beetles. And the adults aren't the ones that are actually consuming the grasshoppers. They're happy to munch on flowers. Not typically of economic importance to a crop. They can be important, to some legume growers, munching on the flowers. And small plot researchers. They can be very important when you concentrate populations. For canola, not typically important. The adults happily munching on petals and pollen and nectar. It's the first instar larvae, these little monsters here, and they're just tiny little farts of insects, like barely visible to the human eye. But they are voracious little predators and wander around munching on grasshopper eggs. So these things will seek out the burrows, lay the eggs near them, and they'll go and munch on the grasshopper eggs. And they can actually do a real number on populations. Working this way, we'll talk crickets, field crickets, both fall field crickets and spring field crickets. We got two species in the province. Take a wild guess as to when they're active. Both of these are important consumers of grasshopper eggs, and they will seek out the grasshopper eggs as they're laid in the soil and munch on them. You can see that this cricket is having a particularly bad day. You notice the giant worm sticking out the butt of this cricket. That's functionally what happened. So this is what's called an emanomorph. It's not a nematode. It's in a different taxon, another large group of worms called the nematomorphs. They're obligate parasites, and what these things do is they're aquatic. So for those of you who have been at the lake and you've looked down at shallow water and you see these worms can be about this long, very skinny. They're called horsehair worms. You see them swimming in the water. That's an emanomorph. And what it does is it lays its eggs in the water. Insect imbibes the water, takes the eggs in. Eggs hatch, develop inside the hemocoel or the blood cavity of the insect. And then when it's time for reproduction, it convinces or it obliges its host to seek out water. And once that host touches water, kerblamo, the worm explodes at the butt of its host. So they will attack crickets, they will attack grasshoppers, they will attack large beetles, including Epicotta. So yeah, large insects are on the menu for these ones. So they need a lot of room. They're a large worm, they need a lot of room to develop. So if Alien would have incorporated that, it probably would have got a little bit more than an R rating, I suppose. And traumatized a lot more people. So, have you seen? Yes, I've seen. Oh my God. So the last one we'll talk about is Entomophthora grillii. This is a fungal pathogen, and isolates of this pathogen are actually specific to different species of grasshopper. So, again, this one obliges its host to change its behavior, climb to the top of a host plant, grab on for dear life, and then croak. And once that animal dies, then the fungal spores are released, and it rains down on all the brothers and sisters and cousins and friends. And there were some real significant accounts of Entomophthora populations in grasshoppers, knocking down whole fields of grasshoppers where you could smell them. You're driving up to them, smelling these rotting grasshoppers from about a mile away. So this one really likes humid conditions. So a couple of years ago, we had summer days that were characterized by thunderstorms, so you get that buildup in humidity. That really favors the outbreak of Entomophthora. And this can have a real limiting impact on grasshopper populations. And as I mentioned before, different isolates, will impact different species. So you can have clearwing and two-stripe right next to each other. All the two-stripe are dying, clearwing's fine, or vice versa. But anyway, that's the take-home message there. So generalists, cutworms, we did have some accounts of spraying for cutworm. It wasn't an exceptional year. Both of these species really like it dry, and of course we had cool, wet spring conditions in a lot of parts of the province. Redback and pale western were the primary species detected. We had a few others detected as well. Generalists, so that you can see them in a number of different crops. They do outbreak when conditions are dry and protracted dry conditions, so there is a potential for outbreak if we do have dry conditions in the spring. Uncultivated fields with broadleaf weeds, again, they're generalists. The girls will lay their eggs on a number of different broadleaf plants, so they're happy to spread the love, as it were. So if you've got a lot of broadleaf weeds in your fields, you may be attracting egg-laying females. Next insect we'll talk about is wheat midge, and we had a bit of a surprise as far as this one goes. So our forecast suggested that we would have low numbers this past summer based on the survey from the previous years. So low but not absent. As it turned out, we had really timely rains, with a relatively cool protracted spring, and we had significant populations of wheat midge in some parts of the province that required spraying. So what's the fundamental take home here is 25 millimeters prior to the end of May is what you're looking at for wheat midge. That is fundamentally the most important factor. You're always going to have some background wheat midge. What we've seen is they functionally won't be absent from large swaths of land. So consider them present, and populations can fluctuate pretty significantly and respond really quickly to these environmental cues. So reason being, they're overwintering as larvae in the soil, and they're going to, when you're a teeny tiny little bug, you're about this far down in the soil, about 4 inches. They get exposed to that moisture in the spring, and they complete their development. So they're going to crawl up to the surface, and they're going to pupate. And they need to do that, and they're stimulated to do that by the moisture. If they don't receive that moisture, they can hunker down for years in a state called delayed diapause. It's a little bit like hibernation, but their development is arrested, and that's the functional difference between diapause and hibernation. So there are some products. So talk about scouting really briefly. Roughly Canada Day. I mean, that's about when growing degree days accumulate. So if you want to be doing this or be at the lake, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. The varietal blends are very effective and an effective set it and forget it solution. Otherwise, scout, and that's going to be right around Canada Day. And the emergence can be protracted over weeks. So, I mean, that's an important consideration as well. So, yield threshold, 1 midge to 4 to 5 heads. These girls like to spread the love around. They'll lay eggs happily on a bunch of different plants. And the grade threshold, 1 to 8 per 10 heads. Of course, most of you are probably aware that chlorpyrifos, which is not arguably, it is the most effective product of the 2 that we have registered, is being phased out by Pest Management Regulatory Agency. So most products will continue until, or use will be permitted until December of this year. We've pulled a couple from the Guide to Crop Protection already, but there are still some chlorpyrifos products. You just can't buy it. So if you have it, if you have it in the shed, you can still use it till December, but otherwise, come December, it's off the table. So dimethoate, Lagon, Saigon, still available, but it doesn't have the ovicidal properties. It's not an egg killer like Lorsban is. So important consideration for that. So once again, SM1 or varietal blends might be a real good solution for you. So looking at the forecast for this coming year, we saw a significant increase. I mean, so we're looking at, and these are these areas that coincided with the timely spring rains. Yeah, I don't think that's coincidental. So we saw increases in population in those areas, and you might want to consider SM1 if you're in that area. I think it's an excellent idea regardless of where you are. Cereal aphids, we did have some accounts of spraying. We got 2 species primarily. We'll get 4 blowing in. They all blow in from the States. But the 2 that we typically see, English grain aphid and bird cherry oat aphid, were prevalent this year. So English green aphid, you're going to see this one a little bit higher on the plant. Bird cherry oat aphid a little bit lower. Once you get to soft dose stage, then that plant is no longer susceptible to the damage. You can have very high numbers without incurring a yield penalty. So it's not very nice to look at, but it's not going to be economically damaging. And if you leave them alone, then you can see your natural enemy complex build up, and it's really good for that. So once again, English green aphid, a little bit higher in the plant. Typically, bugs don't always follow the rules, so a little bit lower on the plant. Oh, pardon me. You're going to see bird cherry oat aphid. Thresholds are the same for both, so cereals, 12 to 15 aphids per stem, again, prior to soft dough. And for canary seed, 10 to 20 on 50% of stems prior to soft dough. So once it gets past that stage, it's no longer sensitive. Wheat stem sawfly, this is dependent on tight wheat rotations and dry cycles. These girls are not superb flyers. Despite being relatively robust wasps, they like to stick pretty close to home, so pretty close to where they complete their development. So rotation is a real effective strategy for limiting their impact, as it can be for a number of different insects. Larval feeding, spring wheat is the preferred host. Larval feeding, 5 to 15% reduction in seed weight. And most of the damage, however, is associated with lodging. So these larvae are going to go down to that first node, and they're going to chew away that first node. Plant flops over, and they've plugged that up with frass, or the mix of chewed up plant material and feces, and they're going to finish their development in there. So it's a real good place to overwinter. It's sheltered. You haven't got the rest of the plant potentially just pulling you up from the ground and limiting your future prospects, as it were. But this lodging can be really problematic when it comes to harvest. So for control, spraying is not recommended. If you're out there scouting and you're seeing adult females flying around, the jig is up. So most of these girls have got their eggs in the plants already. So not much point in spraying. There's not really an economic benefit to it. Management of 10 to 15% cutting the previous year, so this is a year-to-year strategy. And resistant cultivars, so that is solid stem cultivars, and these are available, and non-host crops. So once again, spring wheat, preferred crop. You can look at even other cereals, barley or oats, and they're much less susceptible. Peas, canola, not impacted by this insect at all. Solid stem varieties, as I mentioned before, and this prevents larval movement. Oh, sorry. I was also going to say, I seem to recall it having it on there, but planting density can have an impact as well as can more robust varieties. Even if those plants are cut, they can be held up by their neighbors. If they're planted at relatively high densities. So even if that plant's been cut off, it could still be harvested and not contribute to lodging. So cabbage seed pod weevil, onto the canola pests. Cutorhynchus obstrictus, near and dear to my heart. This is the one I did my doc work on. So I've inconvenienced a lot of these animals. So invasive, first reported in Alberta in '95, Saskatchewan in 2000, and we got some interesting results from the survey this year because it is invasive, and the rules of invasiveness typically say that this range is going to continue to expand and the population is going to continue to increase. And I'm going to put a semicolon on that and wait for the next slide. So adult feeding can contribute to bud blast. It affects canola, brown mustard, and wild mustard. These are the true hosts because the bulk of the damage is associated with larval feeding. So this girl is going to find a pod, developing pod, chew a little hole in there with her. She's got mandibles at the end of that proboscis, and she's going to chew a little hole in there, wheel around, lay a single egg in there, and then mark it with what's called an oviposition deterring pheromone. And what that does is it tells other females not to lay an egg in there because there can be only one. They're cannibals. Yeah, they're really bad at sharing. So if you see one insect in there, weevil larvae are relatively conspicuous, but if you see a little, multiple little grub-looking things in a pod, that is probably canola flower midge. And that one isn't typically economically damaging, but it can be pretty conspicuous. So a good way of telling those apart just at a glance. So you got little orange wigglers, multiple ones, canola flower midge, especially in northern regions. So this oviposition, the developing larva is going to consume seeds in the true hosts. and then they're going to chew their way out. So both that entry hole and the exit hole, that can be avenues for pathogens and contribute to shatter. The adults can also show up later and in really big numbers feed on pods and cause continued damage. So looking at the survey from last year, very dry conditions, of course, in the southwest. We saw a real reduction in host plant quality and a reduction in populations. So that population didn't come roaring back significantly in 2022, but this is the really kind of cool bit. You see all the dark green here, or the darker green? You see how the population has retracted. So the population has reduced and retracted over the past year. So not certain if that's due to the drought conditions or exactly what that's associated with, but yeah, a lot of people are giving it some thought, and we'll hopefully have some answers to that. So. Diamondback moth, this is one that we monitor with a number of different collaborators in the province. This one's migratory, so it spends its winters in Florida and North Texas and Texas and Mexico, sometimes in the Pacific Northwest. We have, as many of you are probably familiar, we're on a bird migratory corridor, and that is used, or the winds that are associated with that is used by a lot of migratory insects as well. So they're getting pushed along by those same high altitude winds that are moving from Texas to the central plains. So yeah, if you see whooping crane, there might be some diamondback moth mixed in with that as well. So they can move great distances on these winds. So I mean 1,000 kilometers a day. This isn't like monarch butterfly where they're doing stepwise migration. They take flight once their host plant quality decreases. So winter crops in this, in Texas, broccoli, cabbage, they're going to build up large numbers of diamondback moth. If those crops get harvested or the host plant quality diminishes, they're going to take flight in big numbers. And they go to these high altitude parcels of air, and they get moved along thousands of kilometers. So typically they're flying 300 to 500 meters. They're following the warm air, right? But they can move as high as 4 kilometers. So they can be very, very high up in the air. And once they meet appropriate conditions, they just fall out of the air column. So again, it's not like a stepwise migration. It's just they go up once and they come down once. And they can come down in Saskatchewan. They can come down as far north as the Yukon and show up in cabbage crops there. So those are the same populations all the way from the southern U.S. and Mexico. So pretty remarkable migration. So we do monitor these ones. Happily numbers were low this year. So we saw a bit of a bump in June, or towards the end of June, and then we continue monitoring for an additional 4 weeks. We wanted some information on what those populations were doing after they arrived, and they increased. They increased pretty dramatically, but the numbers remain low. So happily the numbers remain low. We continue to monitor for these ones. They can be a devastating pest, and they can influence all stages of canola. Real interesting natural enemy of this one. This one actually follows them up from Texas. So Diadegma insularis, important parasitoid of them. Yeah, so their natural enemy is actually following them as they migrate. Ligas, very few reports of spraying for ligas. This past year, happily, compared to 2021, of course, was a bad ligas year. Ligas likes it hot and it likes it dry. So happily we didn't have those conditions widespread in the province this year. Around Rosetown, we did have some accounts of spraying, both in canola and quinoa. And as that indicates, pretty broad host range. They feed on a number of different host plants. A real important consideration too is when we're talking about ligas bugs, we're talking about 8 different species. And each of them have specific host ranges and host preferences. And you're going to see different ones in canola than you might see in faba, than you might see in some other crops. So at a glance, they're all ligas, but we are dealing with multiple species, so which just complicates everything. So there is a new nominal threshold, and this was proposed by Hector Carcamo of Ag Canada, and I think supported by entomologists in Western Canada for the most part. And that is a nominal threshold of 2 to 3 per sweep at late flower to early pod, full stop. Doesn't matter what the commodity price is, doesn't matter what the control cost is, 2 to 3 per sweep, full stop. Reason being is at high commodity prices, those tables indicated that your tolerance for these things should be nil, which is problematic because you're just going to wipe out your natural enemy complex. So to preserve that natural enemy complex and With new varieties, there's evidence that they actually respond through compensatory regrowth to Lygus feeding with an increase in yield. So at numbers of 1 or lower per sweep, there's evidence now that the plant, they're making the canola angry and it's actually yielding more. So yeah, plants are really interesting. Yeah, compensatory regrowth is well described in a number of different systems. Okay. So they are heavily influenced by weather conditions. So when things are cool and wet, fungal outbreaks. Sorry, I'm going to have to race through a couple of these slides to talk about some other things here. Bertha, very low numbers. However, we may be due for an outbreak soon. They do cycle on about a 6 to 8 year cycle, and things are ramping up slightly. And of course, flea beetles. We still have 2 primary species. The Saskatoon area, which has been characterized by heavy striped flea beetle numbers, was actually, they all but vanished this year. So it was mostly crucifer flea beetles. So we have anthropogenic factors like insecticide inputs influencing their populations and climate factors. So crucifer flea beetle is much more sensitive to insecticide applications or the commercial insecticide applications that we've been using, that is group 4 and group 28, then is striped, so that can influence control. However, resistance to these groups has not yet been documented. Boyd Morey at the University of Alberta has spent, we have concerns about group 3 insecticides, and he spent some time as his postdoctoral fellow has looking at group 3 resistance, and it hasn't been detected yet, which is happy news. So I'm sure most are familiar with the life cycle of these. The take home from this is that stripe tends to come up 2 weeks earlier. So it can come up as early as mid-April. We also have another 3rd species, the hop flea beetle, which can be present in large numbers, but its economic importance isn't well understood. So for seed treatments, we have, I'm sure many of you, most of you are familiar with the commercial seed treatments available. We've got group 4As, or the neonics, glutathione, a number of products, thiamethoxam, another as helix, and imidacloprid as sombrero. We've also got some other group 4s. There's a new one, a 4D, called Buteo Start, and anecdotal evidence from this one so far, reports have been really strong for both species. It's a little bit more money, of course. It is a premium product, but results have been good, as well as sulfoxaflor, which is a 4C, and this is only available as a co-pack with other products, so it's most effective as this co-pack. We've also got group 28s, which have, these are diamides, so really good Lepidoptera activity, so real good cutworm activity, and also some activity on flea beetles as well. So economic thresholds, 25% defoliation if they're active and present, because you can get to that 50% economic injury level real quick. So you're going to need to act quickly if you arrive at that 25%. Foliar products, and this has been a hot topic. So Lambda Psi is not being banned. So there has been a label change to it, and Syngenta has opted to do a recall on this so that they can retool their label and release the product. So the Syngenta products, Matador and Volume Express, will not be available this year. Adama, the manufacturer of Silencer, and a new product called Zivada, which is functionally Silencer 120, will be available. They're optimistic that this will be available, and it is permitted on canola and flax and mustard for oilseed, but not mustard for condiment use. So that use has been taken off. Most of the restrictions are associated with livestock feed. So if it's for livestock feed or pasture use, then consider that to be off the table, at least for the time being. So, but Silencer and La Bamba will be available, but you'll note group 3, group 3, group 3, group 3. There's lots of group 3 products. I mean, so you know, if you can't get your hands on a Lambda Psi product, you got lots of options. And the Europeans are having a really bad time with group 3 resistance. So you might want to consider another mode of action. You know, they're having, the French and the Germans and the English are struggling with group 3 resistance in their flea beetle populations and their cabbage seed pod weevil populations. And happily, we don't have pollen beetle here, but that's a real problem there too. I think the Germans and the French are having a real problem with pollen beetle resistance. So we do have a 1A in the form of 7, and malathion as a 1B. Malathion has another advantage, is that its efficacy actually increases with temperature, whereas the group 3s, they top out at 25C. Once you get to 25C, they don't top out, but they start to volatilize, and then their efficacy diminishes. So when things are hot, you might want to look at a non-group 3 insecticide for controlling. So culture control, plant as shallow as moisture will allow, early seeding, question mark. There's as much evidence for early and late seeding, and it seems the more years that we get behind us, the more complicated that issue becomes. So I'm going to leave that question mark there for the time being. Seed into standing stubble, increased seeding rates. So again, spread the love around. You got the same number of flea beetles, more plants, and you can reduce the individual damage that's going to be inflicted on a plant. And wider row spacings. Yeah, unfortunately, I realize that the current trend is for reduced seeding rates, and with the price of some of the seed treatments, I understand the pressures for that. So I'm going to race through the pulse pests because I've got very limited time, and I want to give you some new research that we've done on ground squirrel control. Pulse pests, we did have a number of reports of pea aphid occurring in a number of different pulse crops, and we also had some reports of group 3 insecticide not working as well as hoped. So we're going to keep an eye on that one as well. It's too soon to say that we're looking at resistance, but it elicited exclamation points over the heads of some people, myself included. For peas and lentils, so Scout 50 to 75 flower, 2 to 3 aphids per 8-inch plant tip, 9 to 12 per sweep. Lentils 30 to 40, and early insecticide application is important. Early seeding is beneficial, as is early insecticide application. You want to get that just as flowering is beginning, and that's where you get the best bang for your buck. So Ning Zhao, who is Sean Prager's master's student, just finished, developed an economic threshold of 103 to 164 aphids per main branch, and that gives you about a 7-day window for activity. And you can see here, they don't like it hot. Mortality increases with temperature. So these animals like it about room temperature. It gets hotter than that, they're not very happy. Finally, pea leaf weevil. These are most important as larvae. That's where the damage is happening, and that's where you need to consider control. You look at what's happening regionally, and you might want to consider a seed dressing for these ones, and thiamethoxam is a very effective seed dressing. So problem with these ones, consume rhizobium in the nodule, so you can see this one actually tunneling into a nodule here. Control of adults has not been demonstrated to be very effective for limiting yield loss. And looking at the populations, low in 2020, increasing moderately in 2021, and kind of come roaring back in 2022. And finally, Richardson's ground squirrel. I'm sure most of you are familiar with what's happening here. PMRA has proposed, or they've issued a final decision on deregistration of strychnine for ground squirrel control. You've got until March 4th of this year, if it's in your shed, to use it. Any use past that is against the law. So please don't do that. So there are alternatives, and these include zinc phosphide products, ZP rodent oat bait or burrow oat bait, rodent oat bait, Rosol RTU or ready to use, and Ramic Green. These are all ready to use formulations. These are zinc phosphide products. These are anticoagulants. We tested these in a field study in Maple Creek and southeastern Alberta with our collaborators there on field plots. 2 game cams in the center of each plot to look for non-target mortality and non-target activity. You get pronghorn moving through there. You get deer. You get elk. You get all kinds of things. Badgers and all the things that eat gophers and all the things that coincide with gophers that could be exposed to these toxins and kill. Happily, I didn't have to submit a pronghorn for necropsy because that would have been really hard to get back in the truck. So we looked at 2-day pretreatment to determine baseline populations, applied our treatment, and then looked for 1 week daily afterwards. So a lot of quality time with binoculars, and then walking the plots and the surrounding areas of the plots. It was kind of zen-y, maybe not so zen-y for the gophers, I guess, but looking. Oh, that's really faded, doesn't it? So anyway, that's the control. Should come come up there. Looking at the efficacy of the treatments, this is the take-home message here. Zinc phosphide products are as effective as strychnine, or were in our trials in 2022. So that is the sweet spot for control is about 30% knockdown of populations, and here we're looking in the range of about 80. And so strychnine, zinc phosphide products, indistinguishable as far as their level of control. Rosol didn't fare all that well. Ramic green was not significantly different, but you can see it was numerically less effective. Did an economic analysis on this as well, and one of the recurring themes is strychnine is the cheapest, strychnine is the best, strychnine is the cheapest, strychnine is the best. We've seen that there are products that are comparable to strychnine as far as efficacy, and it's certainly not the cheapest. So strychnine, about $13 an acre, and that includes the oats you got to mix it up with. Burro oat bait, which is a ready to use, that's everything you need, comes out of the bag. You open up the bag, you stick your spoon, you fire it down the hole. And you can use bait stations with these ones, which you can't use with strychnine. And ZP rodent oat bait, indistinguishable from an efficacy perspective, still cheaper than strychnine. Looking at the anticoagulants, and you have to put multiple treatments down for the anticoagulants. 2 for Rosol, so you're looking $30 an acre. Ramic green, sometimes you have to put down 3, so you're looking at $30 an acre again. So considerably more expensive for the anticoagulants. Best results achieved if baits are applied before spring green up. And I'll jump ahead to the next slide really quickly. Another strike against anticoagulants, vitamin K is the antidote. So gopher feels sick, gopher eats plant, gopher gets antidote. So especially legumes are particularly high in vitamin K. So if you got to go for population next to alfalfa, yeah, just don't waste your time. Zinc phosphide, very low as far as residues go. So very little concern for, or much reduced concern, I'll never say no concern, much reduced concern for non-targets because the active ingredient, the zinc phosphide, breaks down into phosphine gas and it outgasses. And this occurs even after the animals died. So here's why you got to do it early. So while you're thinking about seeding, you should be thinking about gopher control. If you had a problem with gophers last year, I've been trying to do a little bit of modeling, get a little bit of predictive power to what's going to happen with gophers. Near as I can figure, it's going to be comparable to what we saw last year. Model still in a state of development, but so you can see here, this can be as early as mid-February in different parts of the province. If you're in the Maple Creek area, these girls are popping up really early. The mature females are the ones you got to control if you want population control. So you can see they're only active for about 100 days. And then they go into a state of torpor, they hibernate. So the ones that you're seeing in late summer, those are the juvenile males. And they're teenage boys, so they're doing all the stupid things that teenage boys do. They're fighting, and and their survivorship isn't all that high, and honestly, you don't need that many males. So I'm probably not benefiting myself there, but yeah, the world doesn't need that many. But you see what I'm getting at. Because they fight like nobody's business in the spring for access to females. So yeah, take a moment to watch the gladiator battles. It's quite intense. The females only come into estrus for 4 hours a year. So yeah, the females are only receptive to males for 4 hours a year. So the fights are pretty intense amongst the males. So. And finally, these are our contributors. And please point your phone at that and sign up for our pest monitoring. And apologies for going long.